The restaurant was a cathedral of hushed voices and polished mahogany, a place where the scent of expensive cologne mingled with the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Zara Bennett moved through the space like a shadow in a crisp white button-down, her movements so efficient she was practically part of the architecture. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, a waitress wasn't a person. She was a ghost with a glass cloth. And that was exactly why she heard it. 2 nights ago, at a corner booth shrouded in candlelight, 3 men in tailored suits had leaned in close. They didn't notice the woman refilling their water. They didn't see the way her hand remained rock-steady as they whispered about the Camille project. They spoke of Min-Seok Ryu, the man who owned half the skyline and a reputation for being untouchable, as if he were a lamb headed for the slaughter. They laughed about a honey trap, a woman named Camille who would walk through his front door and dismantle his empire from the inside out. Now, table 9 was occupied by the man himself. Min-Seok Ryu sat with a quiet, terrifying dominance, his dark hair styled back and the subtle ink on his neck peeking out from a deep navy suit. Across from him sat Camille Laurent, the embodiment of refined elegance in a black silk dress. She was smiling, her red lips curved in a way that looked like love but smelled like a funeral. Zara felt the weight of the folded scrap of paper in her apron pocket. It was a death sentence or a lifeline, depending on who caught her passing it. As she stepped toward the table, bottle in hand, she realized she was no longer just a waitress. She was the only person in the city who could stop a king from falling into a grave dug by the woman he was starting to trust. Please like and subscribe so as to enjoy more stories. The air in the sapphire room was thick with the scent of vintage scotch and the low, rhythmic hum of calculated greed. It was 2 nights before the lunch that would change everything, and Zara Bennett was moving through the shadows of the VIP lounge with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being part of the furniture. To the 3 men huddled in the far corner booth, she wasn't a witness. She was merely the hand that replaced the crystal ashtray and the silent shadow that kept their glasses amber and full. She didn't look at their faces. In this world, eye contact was a challenge, and Zara preferred to be a ghost, but her ears were tuned to a different frequency. Ryu is too comfortable, a voice rasped, Arthur Vance, a man whose wealth was built on the wreckage of smaller shipping firms. He thinks his silence is a shield. He doesn't realize we've already walked through the front door. Zara's hand didn't falter as she set a fresh bottle of Macallan on the table. She kept her gaze on the label, her breathing shallow and even. Min-Seok Ryu was a name that carried a specific kind of gravity in this city. He was the calm at the center of the storm, a businessman whose power was felt more than it was seen. He was also the only regular who ever looked Zara in the eye and tipped with a nod of genuine respect. "Camille is perfect," another man whispered, leaning in so close his breath clouded the glass. "He actually thinks he met her by chance at that gallery opening. He's inviting her into the inner circle next week. By the time they're standing at an altar, we'll have the keys to every encrypted server in his empire." The 3rd man chuckled, a dry, papery sound. The great Min-Seok Ryu, brought down by a soft voice and a black silk dress. He spent a decade building a fortress, never realizing the honey trap was already inside the walls. Once she secures the biometric signatures, he's a dead man walking. His assets will be liquidated before the honeymoon is over. Zara moved away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that her face refused to show. She walked toward the service station, her mind racing. They weren't just talking about a corporate takeover. They were talking about a slow, methodical execution. Camille wasn't a lover. She was a parasite, a weapon designed to find the one crack in Ryu's armor, his solitude. As she polished a stray smudge off a wine glass, Zara looked across the dimly lit room. She had spent years watching the powerful destroy each other, staying silent and staying safe. But as she pictured Min-Seok Ryu, his quiet dominance, the controlled way he moved, the lonely dignity of his position, the silence felt like a weight she could no longer carry. The rivals continued to toast to their victory, unaware that the invisible woman in the black apron had just become the most dangerous person in the room. Zara felt the shift in herself. The ghost was gone. She was now a guardian of a secret that could burn the city down, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to look away. The Ryu estate sat atop the city's highest ridge, a monolith of glass and cold basalt that seemed to watch the world below with a predatory detachment. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, muffled thud of Min-Seok Ryu's bare feet against the gym mats. He moved with a clinical, terrifying grace, his lean frame glistening with a thin sheen of sweat that caught the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The ink on his chest, a dragon coiling upward toward his jaw, shifted with every calculated strike he threw at the heavy bag. Min-Seok lived in a world of variables he could control, a fortress built on the premise that trust was a luxury for those who could afford to die. His house was a temple of minimalism. No family photos, no cluttered shelves, only the essential tools of a man who managed an empire from the shadows. He had spent his 30s turning his heart into a vault, convinced that the weight of his crown was a burden meant to be carried alone. But lately, the vault had a hairline fracture. He stepped away from the bag, his breathing deep and controlled, and reached for his phone. A message glowed on the screen. "I found that first edition we talked about. It reminded me of your library. Sleep well, Min-Seok. C." A ghost of a smile, so brief it wouldn't have registered on a security camera, flickered across his sharp features. Camille Laurent was the first person in a decade who didn't look at him as a set of assets or a threat to be managed. When they sat in his vast, quiet library, she didn't flinch at the armed men stationed at the perimeter of the property. She spoke of art, of history, and of the strange, quiet loneliness that came with being at the top. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a bunker. It felt like a home. He walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling grid of city lights. To the world, he was the master of the mansion, an untouchable businessman with a jawline like a blade and a temper to match. But as he looked at Camille's name on the screen, he felt a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth. He was a man who prided himself on seeing the move before it was made, yet he was beginning to lower his guard, lured in by the soft waves of her hair and the way she seemed to understand the silence he lived in. He didn't know that the woman he was picturing as his partner was actually the architect of his ruin. He didn't know that every accidental, shared interest was a data point fed to him by his enemies. In the stillness of his glass fortress, Min-Seok Ryu believed he was finally finding a reason to stop fighting. He was a king who had survived 1,000 wars, never realizing that the one enemy who would actually get close enough to strike was the one he was planning to give the keys to the kingdom. He set the phone down and headed for the showers, unaware that across town, a waitress in a black apron was already mourning the man he was about to become. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories like this, please make sure you like and subscribe. The glass doors of the restaurant swung open, admitting a draft of midday air that felt like a warning. Zara was already at the service station, her fingers tightening around a leather-bound menu as she watched Min-Seok Ryu enter. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that usually anchored the room, but today, there was a subtle softening in his posture that made Zara's chest ache. Beside him, Camille Laurent was a vision of curated perfection in a sleeveless black dress, her smile radiant and her hand resting lightly on the crook of his arm. To anyone else, they were the city's most enviable power couple. To Zara, they were a predator and a marked man walking into a slaughterhouse. "Table 9, Zara," the maitre d' murmured, snapping her back to the present. She smoothed her black apron, took a steadying breath, and stepped into the light of the dining room. As she approached, the sensory details hit her with the force of a physical blow. The faint, expensive scent of Camille's perfume, the cold gleam of Min-Seok's watch, and the way he pulled out Camille's chair with a touch that was uncharacteristically gentle. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ryu. Ms. Laurent," Zara said, her voice a flawless mask of professional neutrality. She didn't let her eyes linger on Min-Seok's face, focusing instead on the placement of the water glasses. "May I start you with something to drink?" "The usual sparkling for the table, Zara, and a bottle of the 15 Cabernet," Min-Seok replied. His voice was deep, a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. He finally looked up, his dark, focused eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. "You look tired today. Late shift." It was a small, human observation, the kind of detail he only noticed because he actually saw her. The weight of the secret in Zara's pocket felt like it had doubled in mass. She was looking at a man who was offering her kindness, while the woman sitting across from him was preparing to steal his soul. "Just a busy morning, sir," Zara replied, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Camille leaned forward, her red lips curving into that lethal, beautiful smile Zara had seen in her nightmares since the night in the lounge. "The atmosphere here is just so calming, isn't it, Min-Seok? I'm so glad you brought me back." "Anything for you, Camille," he murmured, his gaze returning to his date with a vulnerability that turned Zara's stomach. Zara moved through the motions of the opening service, pouring the water, setting the bread, unfolding the linen napkins, but her mind was a battlefield. She could hear the echo of the rivals' laughter in the back of her head, mocking Min-Seok's blindness. Every time she reached near the table, she felt the frantic urge to scream, to break the professional silence, to shatter the expensive crystal and tell him to run. Instead, she remained the invisible servant. She retreated to the shadows of the service bar, clutching her tray so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at the two of them, the king of the city and his beautiful executioner, and knew that the next time she approached table 9, she wouldn't just be bringing a bottle of wine. She would be carrying the match that would burn Camille's masquerade to the ground. The swinging doors of the kitchen slammed shut behind Zara, cutting off the soft jazz and expensive whispers of the dining room. Inside, the world was a cacophony of hissing steam, the rhythmic clatter of stainless steel, and the sharp, acidic scent of searing lemons and reduced wine. It was a factory of high-end chaos, and for once, Zara felt the heat not from the stoves, but from the frantic pounding of her own pulse. She retreated to the narrow service station at the far end of the line, a small corner shielded by a stack of silver warming domes. Her hands were shaking, a traitorous micro-movement she suppressed by gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter. Every second she spent away from table 9 was a second Camille spent weaving her web tighter around Min-Seok. Her eyes darted to the pass. The floor manager, a man who saw staff as replaceable parts in a machine, was busy berating a runner near the walk-in. This was her only window. Zara reached into the hidden pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, rectangular order slip. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts as she fumbled for the pen clipped to her waist. She didn't have space for a letter. She had space for a warning. She had to strip away the prose and leave only the jagged edges of the truth. "They are setting you up," she scribbled, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. "Camille is not who she says. She is working for Vance. She is here for the biometrics. Your empire is the target. Do not trust the smile." She paused, the tip of the pen hovering over the paper. The rivals had mentioned a wedding, a slow bleed, a digital execution. She added 2 more lines, her handwriting becoming smaller, sharper. "Track her device. Call me when you are alone." At the very bottom, she wrote her private cell number, the digits looking like a desperate plea on the white background. "Bennett, why isn't the Cabernet on the table?" The manager's voice cracked like a whip across the humid air. Zara flinched, instinctively slamming a silver saucer over the note. Her heart surged into her throat, a cold sweat breaking out across her neck. "Just checking the vintage temperature, sir," she replied, her voice remarkably level despite the riot in her chest. She didn't look back at him. She couldn't. She folded the slip of paper until it was a tiny, hard square no larger than a postage stamp. It felt heavy, like a lead weight that could pull her under. She tucked it into the palm of her hand, beneath the base of the wine bottle she was meant to serve. As she pushed through the double doors and back into the cool, predatory silence of the dining room, the transition felt like stepping onto a tightrope. She could see Min-Seok leaning in toward Camille, his expression open in a way that made him look human and dangerously mortal. Zara tightened her grip on the bottle. She was no longer just a waitress delivering a vintage. She was a saboteur carrying the truth into the heart of a lie. One slip, one stray glance from Camille, and the note would be her own death warrant. But as she approached table 9, her fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The ghost had a message, and it was time for the king to listen. The dining room of the restaurant was a symphony of controlled elegance, but as Zara approached table 9, the air felt thick, like the moments before a lightning strike. Min-Seok was leaning toward Camille, his sharp jawline softened by a rare, genuine smile. Camille was laughing, a melodic, practiced sound that Zara now recognized as the clicking of a trap. Zara's hand was steady as she held the chilled bottle of Cabernet, but her mind was calculating every inch of the mahogany table. She knew she couldn't just hand him a note. Camille was a professional. Her eyes were trained to catch any movement that didn't belong to a servant. Zara had to be more than a waitress. She had to be a ghost in the machine. "Your wine, Mr. Ryu," Zara murmured, her voice a low, soothing anchor. She stepped into the narrow space between the two diners. As she reached forward to clear a stray, empty appetizer plate, she intentionally tilted the water carafe just a fraction too far. A single, shimmering bead of condensation rolled off the glass and splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, right beside Min-Seok's hand. "Oh, I am so sorry, sir," Zara whispered, her tone a perfect blend of professional horror and practiced humility. The error was so minor, so human, that it drew Camille's eyes away for a split second, long enough for Camille to feel a flash of condescending pity for the clumsy waitress. In that heartbeat of distraction, Zara moved. She reached out with a linen napkin to dab at the microscopic spill. Beneath the white fabric of the napkin, Zara's thumb pressed the tiny, folded square of paper directly into the palm of Min-Seok's hand. For a fraction of a second, his muscles tensed. His fingers, scarred and powerful, instinctively began to close into a fist, a warrior's reflex to an unexpected touch. Zara didn't pull away. She met his gaze, not with the blank stare of a servant, but with a sharp, burning intensity that screamed for him to understand. It was a silent plea, a bridge thrown across a chasm of lies. Min-Seok's dark eyes narrowed, searching hers. He felt the sharp corners of the paper. He saw the fraction of a second where Zara's composure flickered, revealing the raw terror beneath. He was a man who lived by his instincts, and his instincts told him that this wasn't a mistake. This was a signal. His hand relaxed, swallowing the note whole as he pulled back from the table. He leaned back into his chair, his expression returning to its mask of calm, untouchable power. "Don't worry about it, Zara," he said, his voice as smooth as the velvet blazer he wore. "Everyone has an off day." "Thank you, sir," Zara replied, her voice trembling just enough to sell the act of a shaken worker. She retreated, her heart hammering so hard she feared it would bruise her ribs. As she walked away, she could feel Camille's eyes on her back, dismissive, disinterested, already forgetting the girl who had just shattered her masterpiece. Behind her, Zara knew Min-Seok's hand was still closed around the paper, the ink bleeding into his skin. The message was delivered. The king was no longer blind. He was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. The interior of the custom-built sedan was a vacuum of leather-scented silence, insulated against the neon blur of the city streaking past the tinted windows. Min-Seok sat in the back, his posture as rigid and controlled as a statue. Beside him, Camille leaned her head against his shoulder, the soft floral notes of her perfume filling the small space. To any observer, he was a man at peace, but beneath the fabric of his navy trousers, his hand was buried deep in his pocket, his thumb tracing the jagged, folded edges of the paper Zara had pressed into his palm. The note felt unnaturally hot against his skin. It was a physical weight, a tether to a reality he had spent the last few months trying to ignore. "You're very quiet tonight, Min-Seok," Camille murmured, her voice a silk thread that pulled at the newfound softness in his chest. She reached over, her slender fingers interlaced with his free hand. Her touch was warm, practiced, and seemingly innocent. "Is it the new acquisition? You've been working too hard." Min-Seok didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. His mind was a battlefield of warring instincts. For years, his survival had depended on a hair-trigger suspicion of everyone: the waiter, the driver, the business partner. But Camille had been his exception. She was the one who didn't ask for favors, who didn't recoil from the dragon inked onto his skin, who made the vast emptiness of his mansion feel less like a tomb. He looked at her in the dim, rhythmic pulse of the passing streetlights. Her symmetrical beauty was illuminated for a heartbeat, then plunged back into shadow. Do not trust the smile. Zara's words, though unread, seemed to vibrate through his fingertips. Why would a waitress, a woman who had served him in silence for years, risk her life to pass him a scrap of paper? There was no profit in it for her, only danger. His logic, cold and clinical, began to dismantle the romantic haze. He thought back to their chance meeting at the gallery. The way she always knew exactly which vintage he preferred. The way she had asked, so casually, about his server locations under the guise of being interested in his brilliant mind. "I'm just tired, Camille," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that betrayed nothing. "The city feels heavy tonight." She squeezed his hand, her expression one of pure, radiant concern. "Then let's just have a quiet night. No phones, no business, just us." Just us? The words sounded like a promise, but as the car pulled into the gated drive of his fortress-like estate, they felt like a threat. He felt the paper crinkle in his pocket, a silent scream of warning. He was a man who had built an empire by being 3 moves ahead of his enemies, yet he had allowed a Trojan horse to sleep in his bed. As the driver opened the door, Min-Seok stepped out into the cold night air, his jaw tightening into a sharp, lethal line. The doubt was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering clarity. He wasn't going to confront her yet. He was going to walk into his house, go to his office, and read the words that would either save his life or break his heart. The king was back in his castle, but for the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in the dark. The heavy oak doors of his private study clicked shut, sealing Min-Seok into a world of cold monitors and silent shadows. Outside that door, Camille was likely drawing a bath, maintaining the charade of a woman in love. Inside, the air felt thin, charged with the static of a looming explosion. He sat at his desk, the small, sweat-stained scrap of paper from Zara's hand smoothed out under the harsh glow of a desk lamp. "Do not trust the smile." The words looked like jagged wounds on the white slip. Min-Seok's fingers flew across his keyboard, bypassing layers of security that protected his home network. He didn't need to steal Camille's phone. He had already mirrored her device to his guest server weeks ago, a standard precaution he had almost felt guilty for maintaining. Now, that guilt was a bitter ash in his throat. He isolated her signal, his eyes scanning lines of code until he found the hidden partition, a secondary, encrypted messaging app disguised as a harmless utility folder. With a few keystrokes, he broke the encryption. The screen flickered, then flooded with data. There were dozens of messages, all sent during the quiet moments they had shared. He saw photos of his private study, shots of the safe behind the library's false wall, and detailed logs of his schedule. But it was the text thread with a contact labeled V that made his blood turn to ice. "He's falling for it," Camille had written 3 nights ago, while she was tucked under his arm on the terrace. "The gallery meeting worked perfectly. He's already giving me access to the biometric bypass for the shipment logs. He's blinded by the loneliness. I'll have the full server keys by the weekend. Finalize the liquidation orders with the others." V's response was a single, chilling sentence. "Once the keys are confirmed, minimize the witness. We don't need a living martyr." Min-Seok stared at the screen, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. The dragon on his chest seemed to tighten, its ink claws sinking into his skin. Every soft word she had whispered, every touch that had felt like a reprieve from his violent life, had been a tactical maneuver. She wasn't just a spy. She was a vulture waiting for him to stop breathing. The betrayal wasn't a sharp pain. It was a cold, hollow vacuum. He thought of Zara, the waitress who had seen through the theater that he, the master of shadows, had missed. She had seen the predator because she was used to being the prey. He leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his narrowed, lethal eyes. He could hear Camille's light footsteps in the hallway, the humming of a melody she knew he liked. The warmth he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. He reached for his personal burner phone and dialed the number at the bottom of Zara's note. He was a man who had spent his life being hunted, but as he listened to the dial tone, he felt the shift. Camille thought she was the one holding the knife, but she had forgotten one thing. Min-Seok Ryu didn't just survive traps, he rebuilt them. "Zara," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration as the call connected. "Tell me everything you heard in that booth." The apartment was small, smelling of rain and cheap jasmine tea, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury Zara had left behind at the restaurant. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her white service shirt, her phone clutched in a hand that hadn't stopped trembling since she clocked out. When the screen finally lit up with an unknown, private number, the vibration felt like an electric shock. She answered on the first ring. For a long moment, there was only the heavy, pressurized silence of a secure line. "Zara," he said. His voice wasn't the polished, performative baritone he used at Table 9. It was lower now, stripped of the public mask, carrying the jagged edge of a man who had just seen the floor fall out from under him. The Mr. Ryu she had served for years was gone. In his place was Min-Seok, the man behind the Dragon Ink. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking before she steadied it. Did you read it?" "I read it and I verified it." There was a pause, and Zara heard the faint click of a lighter. "You were right about everything. Camille, Vance, the biometrics. They were waiting for me to fall asleep so they could bury me." Zara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a lifetime. "I heard them in the lounge 2 nights ago. They thought I was just a ghost, someone to refill their scotch and empty their ashtrays. They called it the Camille Project. They laughed about how easy it was to use your solitude against you." "My solitude," Min-Seok repeated, the words sounding like a bitter draft. "They found the one thing I didn't know how to defend, but they didn't count on you." "I couldn't just watch it happen," Zara said, her gaze fixed on the flickering street lamp outside her window. "Everyone in that city sees you as a god or a monster, Min-Seok, but I saw a man who was actually trying to trust someone. I couldn't let them destroy that." The use of his first name hung in the air, a final bridge crossed. The barrier between the powerful billionaire and the invisible waitress had dissolved into the midnight air. They were just 2 people now, caught in the crosshairs of a conspiracy that didn't care about their titles. "You risked everything to pass me that note," Min-Seok said, his tone shifting into something darker, more protective. "Vance and his people, they don't leave witnesses. If they find out you're the leak, they won't just fire you. Do you understand the danger you're in?" "I knew the stakes when I scribbled that paper," she replied, her voice gaining a sharp, newfound steel. "I'm not a victim, Min-Seok. I'm the only one who knows their faces and their plans. Use me." "I intend to," he said, and Zara could almost feel the cold, predatory focus returning to him through the phone. "They think the trap is still set. They think I'm still blind. We're going to let them keep thinking that until it's too late for them to run. Stay away from the restaurant tomorrow. I'm sending a car to your address. From this moment on, you aren't working for the house. You're working with me." As the call ended, Zara looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The waitress was gone. In her place was a woman who had just stepped out of the shadows and into a war. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ryu estate, casting long, clinical shadows across the breakfast table. Min-Seok sat across from Camille, watching her over the rim of his porcelain coffee cup. She was radiant in a cream-colored silk robe, her laughter as light and deceptive as the morning mist. To the world, he was the same quiet, smoldering enigma she had spent months cataloging. To Min-Seok, she was a ghost already being exorcised. "You seem rested," Camille murmured, reaching across the table to brush her fingers against his hand. "The quiet night was exactly what you needed." "You were right, as always," Min-Seok replied, his voice a perfect instrumental of calm. He didn't pull away. He let her touch him, feeling the cold calculation behind her warmth. "I feel like a new man. In fact, I've decided to move the server migration to tonight. I want the business settled so we can focus on us." He watched the micro-expression in her eyes, a flicker of predatory triumph suppressed behind a mask of supportive affection. "Tonight?" she asked, her voice breathless. "Are you sure you're ready for that step, Min-Seok? It's a lot of trust." "I've never felt more certain," he said, and for once the words were entirely true. As soon as he left for the office, Min-Seok signaled his security team. But he wasn't calling for a hit. He was calling for a theater. Following Zara's detailed account of the rival's plan, he directed his IT specialists to create a honeypot server, a digital labyrinth filled with poisoned data, bank accounts that would trigger international red flags the moment they were accessed, and biometric signatures that would lead directly to the FBI's cybercrime division. Meanwhile, Zara sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, her eyes fixed on a tablet Min-Seok's team had provided. She was no longer refilling water. She was monitoring the real-time communications between Camille and Arthur Vance. "She's signaling them," Zara whispered into her headset, her voice steady. "She just sent the green code. They think they're walking into your vault at midnight." "Let them come," Min-Seok's voice crackled in her ear, dark and resonant. "They spent months trying to turn my home into a grave. It's only fair I return the favor." By nightfall, the trap was sealed. Camille sat in Min-Seok's library, her fingers hovering over his primary console, believing she was downloading the keys to his kingdom. She didn't see the silent, dark-clad figures moving through the gardens, or the way Min-Seok stood in the doorway, watching her through the reflection in a darkened monitor. The revenge wouldn't be a loud explosion. It would be a total erasure. As Camille hit the execute button, Zara watched the rivals' screens across the city light up with the digital signature of their own downfall. The bank accounts they thought they were draining were actually being emptied into offshore charities in their own names, creating a paper trail of embezzlement that would keep them in federal prison for decades. Min-Seok finally stepped into the light of the library. Camille spun around, her face pale, the mask finally shattering as she saw the predatory stillness in his eyes. "The migration is complete, Camille," he said softly, walking toward her. "But you're the one leaving." He didn't need to raise his hand. The game was over. As his security team escorted a trembling Camille out into the night, Min-Seok looked at the phone on his desk. He dialed Zara. "It's done," he said. "The table is cleared." "And what happens now?" Zara asked, looking out at the city from the safety of the safe house. "Now," Min-Seok replied, a rare, genuine shadow of a smile touching his lips, "we find a new restaurant. One where the staff knows how to keep a secret, but the guests know who to thank." The waitress and the boss, two people who had spent their lives being watched, finally stepped into a future where they were the ones in control.